Hey guys, I'm Mike with ECS Tuning. Today we're going to go over a DIY installing a Victor Reinz valve cover gasket in our N54 335. This isn't too difficult of a DIY, basically just your average hand tools, but it is a little time consuming. So we're going to go over some little tips and tricks and kind of go over that whole process on our car. If you know these cars, you'll realize this engine bay looks a little different. We have a bunch of the Turner goodies on here. We have the Turner turbo side intake, we have the cowl delete setup and the covers, and Turner catch can on here. So it really frees up the engine bay, but as far as the process of a valve cover goes, it's really not going to change that much for you. Because there's a bunch of power cables going across the engine, we're going to start with disconnecting the ground of the battery. It's kind of a very important first step for any procedure similar to this. All right, next up we're going to gain access to the valve cover itself. For this operation, we're going to remove the Turner intake here. It's just 2 hose clamps on the back and 1 fastener here. Next up, we're going to remove the engine cover. Next up, we're going to remove the PCV hose from the valve cover. By this age, these clips can be a little fragile, so I like to take a little 90-degree pick and kind of finesse it off a little bit. That way I don't break any of the little tangs. I can sneak that out. Then we can remove this hose, which I've already loosened. Loosen this. Remove the catch can. And the hose from it. Get this all out of the way. I'm also going to remove this bracket to give myself a little more access. It's just 2 10mm on this. Now we're going to move this brace to get a little more access around this back corner. This is an E14 here and an E18 up in the cowl. I'm going to disconnect the coils, work my way across, get these all out of the way. Remove each coil. So now we're going to unclip the plugs on each injector here, which so there's just a little tab here, and it's a little clip on the injector. So a little 90-degree pick to kind of take some tension off of this this tang here, makes it a lot easier. Can you just pull them? Yep, sure can. I don't think you're supposed to be able to. I think our car's just been apart. Oh, okay, just that one. Okay, then we're going to undo these 3 ground positions here. It's just a little 8mm nut on all 3. Be careful not to drop that nut. The harness itself is held down by 2 E11 Torx, so we're going to remove those. See how far this comes out of the way, which appears to not be very far. Now, depending on how dirty your car is, or if there's leaves or acorns or squirrels or whatever gets into your engine bay, now's a really good time to suck this out before pulling the injectors or the valve cover. You don't want any of that dirt to go into either the motor or the injectors themselves. We're going to remove the 2 O2 sensor plugs and then disconnect them. Get them out of the way. We're going to remove this plug at the back of the fuel rail for the pressure sensor. There's just a little tang on the bottom you need to squeeze. Next up, we're going to remove the pressure line to the fuel rail. I like to put a little rag under it, especially if your engine's hot. This is a high pressure fuel rail, so there's going to be a lot of fuel spraying out. It should only be for a second. This car's been sitting over the long weekend, so I doubt there's going to be very much pressure. But pay attention, don't get sprayed in the face. Our car had no pressure. Then I'm going to remove the 11mm that hold the fuel rail to the head. There's 4 of them. All right, next up we're going to crack all these free, all the fuel injector hard lines to the injectors themselves. It's just a 14mm wrench. This little plastic drip tray is in the way of the hard lines, so I'm going to remove the oil fill cap momentarily. There's little arrows that line up between the valve cover and the cap itself. You squeeze the side, and you can pull it off, and just lift this tray off. Remove the fuel rail. I'm going to throw the cap back on so I don't drop anything and no debris can get in. I'm going to cap all the injectors so no dirt gets into the inlet of the injector. We have a bunch of these little silicone caps around. You can use whatever you want. I do not suggest paper towel because you don't want any of the lint getting into them. And the last thing we're going to remove before starting to disconnect fasteners for the valve cover is these 2 vacuum lines. I'm just going to disconnect them on this end and then flop them over the other side. There's these 3 ground studs that we removed the wires from earlier. To get those off, it's just a 10mm deep socket, but you have to put the socket on first so that it engages the nut, then put your extension on. Otherwise, your extension bottoms out and doesn't actually engage the nut. I'm going to drop on the socket, make sure it's engaged, have my extension. These fasteners are captive to the valve cover, so you'll know when they're loose because they'll wiggle, but they won't actually remove from the plastic. We're going to go down and do the other two. Alright, the only thing left holding the valve cover on is all of the E11 Torx are on the outside and inside here. So we're going to remove all those and then remove the cover. The bolts around the back can be a little tricky to get to. I like to use a little universal. These can be a little frustrating. If they're used and older, they'll be super floppy. A good trick for that is do a couple wraps of electrical tape that stiffens it up. So that way you can feed it down into position without it flopping over all over the place. We have all 28 of the E11 Torx bolts loose. They are captive as well, so you can tell when they're loose when they wiggle. So make sure they're all good and loose. Then we should be able to just lift off the valve cover, like so. You're gonna kind of pick it up high enough over the injectors back here. Sometimes, if you didn't loosen all your fasteners, a couple will grab, like they are on me right now. All right, now that the valve cover's off, usually you're changing this because it's leaking, and by that point, this gasket's really hard and brittle. So you want to make sure you have all the pieces and you didn't drop any in the engine. So make sure you have all the pieces of every puzzle here. This one's not bad, it's still relatively soft. We didn't lose any pieces, nothing stuck to the head itself. So we're going to deal with this in a minute. Next thing that's very important is prepping this gasket surface. You'll see a lot of little kind of sand and dirt and debris around. You want to make sure you wipe that away from the engine, not into the motor itself. And pay careful attention to these little ports here. These are PCV ports to the intake, so you want to make sure you wipe away from those and don't get any debris into those either. I'm just going to use some brake clean and a rag and then kind of carefully wipe the whole surface down, this intersection as well, get it all prepped and ready, and then we'll deal with the gasket. All right, I've got the old gasket removed, pulled out all the pieces, and cleaned everything really well. I just used some brake clean and blew out all these channels. You want this to be clean and dry. It really helps the valve cover gasket stay in place. I prefer not to use silicone unless I have to. You have a gasket that keeps falling out no matter what you do. If you flip this over, you could put a little bit in some of the corners just to get the gasket to stay. Once it's in the car, it's hard to put the gasket back in, so we want to make sure it stays and it's nice and in place on the bench. But I'm just going to walk my way around, starting at a corner. Kind of make sure your corners line up. Sometimes you have to put a little tension depending on how the gasket sat. Make sure all your corners sit really nice. And make sure it's fully seated. Work your way around. Want all the notches to line up well. Okay, got the gasket in place. Everything's seated nice. All the notches line up well. With everything clean and dry, it sticks really nice, which is good. We don't want any corners rolling out the whole time. I'm going to throw the spark plug tubes back in. Just got to put it back in. The most important part when you're trying to feed this in is not catching the back edge of this gasket on anything. It's really easy to catch either the strap or these back edges on either the cam girdles here or the injector, all while trying to sneak past this wiring. It can be a bit fidgety. You want to take your time, don't force anything, and really just pay attention to these back corners. So I'm going to try to sneak this in. Also watch your spark plug tubes on the way in. They can catch on the head boss pretty easily. Sneak those by. Drop down. Seat all your spark plug tubes by kind of pressing lightly across those. You want to make sure the valve cover gasket doesn't, or the valve cover itself doesn't rock. So you can kind of push on opposite corners here. If it rocks, that's usually because the gasket rolled and is holding up a corner. And if you were to torque it down like that, it can crack the cover. So we're just gonna run our fingers around, make sure the gap feels even. Usually you can feel the edge of the gasket a little bit. So make sure everything's in the right place. Then we'll start tightening our fasteners, working from the inside out. I'm gonna get all these fasteners tightened, just threaded in by hand and hand tight. Then we're gonna go around, working from the center out, tightening them to 8.5 Newton meters, which is also 75 inch-pounds. Okay, we're gonna start torquing them down. I've got this set to 75 inch-pounds. We're gonna work away from the middle out, kind of in a crisscross pattern. All right, we have our valve cover torqued and reinstalled. Now it's time to install the fuel rail again. So we're going to remove our caps. Fish our line nut back up here. Then we're going to throw the rail in. Get everything in position. I like to start these nuts by hand before I bolt anything down, just to get it in position. Saves you a little fumbling later. Because you can wiggle the rail a little bit to make sure the nuts seat correctly. We're going to do the same with this input line here, or the feed line. And we're going to grab our bolts for the rail to the head. All right, I'll fish these bolts back in. Now we can tighten our feed line to the rail, as well as all the injectors. Next up, we're going to put our vacuum lines back on. Fish these back under the rail and clip them into place. Okay, now we can plug our fuel pressure sensor back in and both O2 sensors. Then we can lay our harness back in for the injectors and coils. We'll throw the bolts back in for the harness. I'm going to plug in each injector. The harness should lay out very easily as it was before. So I'm going to put the ground cables on while I plug in the injectors. Throw the nuts back on each stud for the grounds. You can reinstall each coil. Plug each one back in. I'm going to reinstall the strut brace. Our catch can bracket goes here. Our PCV hose and catch can. Still have the little piece for under the oil fill cap. Now it's time to reinstall the rest of our intake. This is the Turner turbo side intake system, which really cleans up the engine bay quite a bit. Put our trim back on. All right, we're going to reinstall the engine cover. And its screws. Now we just have to reconnect the battery, and we're back in action. That's it. Valve cover gasket replacement is done. It's not too difficult. Make sure you're observant, take your time, don't rush anything, and it's really not that difficult. Make sure you like and subscribe. Leave any comments if you have any questions. We'll try to address them. And check out the links in the description.